Turns out, food insecurity and the obesity paradox. Here's the paradox that's been haunting public health researchers for years. The families with the least money for food often have the heaviest kids. You'd think scarcity would mean less eating, but somehow the poorest households are producing some of the highest obesity rates. And a new study from Turkey just cracked open exactly how this backwards math actually works. So what's happening in these households that makes hunger and obesity move in lockstep? That's what we're figuring out today. For decades, we've treated obesity and food insecurity like their enemies. One means too much food, the other means too little. They shouldn't coexist. They shouldn't even be in the same conversation. But they absolutely do coexist, and they're doing it more than ever. About 27% of American households experience some level of food insecurity in any given year. At the same time, obesity rates haven't budged. In fact, they've gotten worse, especially in lower-income families. Public health officials kept wondering, how is this possible? How can you be both hungry and overweight? The assumption was that we just weren't looking at the data closely enough, or maybe the two problems were affecting different families entirely. But that wasn't it. The real answer was way more complicated and way more interesting. In June 2026, a trio of nutrition researchers from Turkey, Yasemin Açar Kuru, K. Esin, and F. Ayyıldız, published their findings in BMC Pediatrics. They work across 3 major Turkish universities, and they decided to dig into a population where this obesity-insecurity connection was particularly visible. Their work is recent, rigorous, and it's giving us the clearest picture yet of how these two crises actually link together. Here's what they did. They recruited 775 families in Turkey, parents between 18 and 65, and their kids between 6 and 14. Online survey, which is important because it let them reach people across different regions without the bias of clinic-based recruitment. These researchers weren't just asking people questions, though. They measured actual body weights and heights for everyone. Then they used 2 validated assessment tools. The USDA's Household Food Security Survey module, which is basically the gold standard for identifying whether a family can reliably afford food, and something called the KidMed, a Mediterranean Diet Quality Index designed specifically for kids. Think of it like this. Imagine you're trying to understand why some plants in a garden are withering. You wouldn't just look at how much water they're getting. You'd also want to know what kind of soil they're in, how much sun they receive, whether anyone's feeding them the right nutrients. This study was doing that, measuring multiple factors simultaneously to see which ones actually predict whether a kid ends up overweight. So what did they find? First, the numbers. 27.9% of the households studied experienced food insecurity. That's roughly 1 in 4 families. Here's where it gets interesting. The households dealing with food insecurity weren't random. They had specific characteristics. They had more children. They had fewer employed adults. They had less money. Basic stuff, right? But here's the part that matters. Among parents who experienced food insecurity, overweight and obesity rates were significantly higher than among parents with reliable food access. The same pattern showed up in the kids. Children from food-insecure households had higher BMIs than their peers from secure households. So the poverty paradox is real. But why? This is where the study gets genuinely insightful. Mediterranean diet adherence came into play. Kids from food-insecure families scored lower on the KidMed index, meaning they were eating less of the things that define a Mediterranean diet: fresh vegetables, legumes, whole grains, olive oil, fish. What were they eating instead? The study doesn't get granular on this, but we know from broader research what happens next. When money gets tight, families reach for calorie-dense, nutrient-poor foods. $1 buys you more calories in processed snacks than it buys in fresh broccoli. It's not stupidity or bad choices. It's math. It's rational behavior under constraints. So you get kids who are eating plenty of calories, actually too many, but from foods that don't satisfy hunger or provide satiety signals. They eat more to feel full. The weight goes up. And here's the detail that ties the whole thing together. This relationship held for both parents and children. It wasn't like the kids inherited poverty and the parents inherited obesity separately. There was a linked pattern. Parental food insecurity predicted parental obesity. It also predicted childhood obesity, which suggests we're not just talking about individual food choices. We're talking about household food environments, family stress, the daily experience of economic precarity. When you're worried about whether there's going to be enough food, your cortisol is elevated. You're more likely to reach for quick, cheap calories. You're modeling these patterns for your kids. You're shopping in food deserts where your only options are convenience stores. The biological, behavioral, and structural factors all reinforce each other. Now, let's talk about what this actually means when you close your laptop and go to the grocery store. First, this isn't about willpower or nutrition knowledge. A parent who can't afford both fresh fish and rent isn't going to choose rent and feel good about the junk food aisle. They're going to resent the system that put them in that position. This study suggests that interventions need to be structural. Providing nutrition education to a food-insecure family is probably less effective than ensuring that family has reliable income. Second, the Mediterranean diet specifically showed up here as protective. That's interesting because it's not the fanciest diet. It's not keto or paleo or any trendy thing. It's built on humble foods that happen to work: beans, seasonal vegetables, small amounts of fish, olive oil. The fact that adherence to this pattern was lower in food-insecure households suggests that scarcity isn't just reducing quantity. It's also reducing access to the foods that would actually help people feel fuller longer and maintain healthier weights. Third, this highlights that obesity isn't a simple calorie problem. It's a food security problem, an access problem, an inequality problem. Here's where we need to be honest about limitations. This is a cross-sectional study, which means it shows relationships but not causation. We can see that food insecurity and obesity cluster together. We can't definitively say that food insecurity causes obesity, though the mechanism makes sense. It's Turkish data too, so we need to see whether these patterns replicate in other countries and cultures. The study is also from online surveys, which means it might be missing families without reliable internet access, which might actually be correlated with food insecurity. But here's what this study fits into: a much larger body of research showing that inequality and health are deeply braided together. This isn't unique to Turkey. This is a pattern showing up globally. The World Health Organization has been warning about this for years. When you have food insecurity and limited resources, you end up with a food environment shaped by affordability, not nutrition. And we pay for it with obesity, metabolic disease, and shorter lifespans. The solution isn't apps that track calories or wellness influencers telling families to just eat healthier. It's policy. It's wages that let people afford fresh food. It's investing in food infrastructure in underserved areas. It's treating food as a human right, not a luxury good. So what should researchers look at next? We need intervention studies. Take food-insecure families, improve their access to nutrient-dense foods, and measure what happens to weight and metabolic health over time. We need to understand whether the Mediterranean diet pattern works for food-insecure families specifically, or whether other traditional diets in other regions might work just as well. We need to follow families longitudinally to see whether moving out of food insecurity leads to weight loss, or whether the damage and stress response is more persistent than that. Turns out, the obesity insecurity paradox isn't a paradox at all once you understand that poverty shapes which foods are available and affordable. And that matters, because it means obesity isn't something we solve by telling people to try harder. It's something we solve by changing the systems that make healthy food a privilege instead of a default. Scientists have been busy and they're not done yet.